Hey there, history buffs. If you're not already subscribed, what are you doing with your life? Hit that button and prepare to have your mind blown by the bizarre, the grotesque, and the absolutely jaw-dropping oddities of our past. Ever heard of the medieval punishment known as the brazen bull? Imagine being cooked alive in a giant metal statue, all while your screams are transformed into the sound of a roaring bull. Deliciously horrifying, right? Or how about the fact that in ancient Rome, they used to have vomitoriums? Spoiler alert, they weren't places to purge your pizza, just a fancy exit for when you needed to escape after one too many grapes at a feast. Now, let's talk myths and legends. Did you know that in 1258, a meteor exploded over the city of Baghdad, creating a shockwave so powerful it was felt for miles? Or how about the infamous dancing plague of 1518, where people literally danced until they dropped, sometimes dead? What were they thinking? Hey, let's cha-cha until we collapse. And let's not forget the grotesque practices of yore. How about the medieval practice of trial by ordeal? Nothing like throwing someone into a river to see if they float, because if they do, clearly they're a witch, right? Makes you want to time travel back and hand out life jackets. Are you intrigued yet? Ready to learn about bizarre facts like the Great Stink of London in 1858, where the smell was so bad it brought Parliament to its knees? Or the fact that some ancient cultures believed in sex as a form of prayer? So, grab your snacks, turn on loop so this episode plays until you drift off, and let's dive into the wild, weird, and sometimes downright alarming tales from history that keep us all awake at night. The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. When one thinks of the Vikings, images of horned helmets, longships, and pillaging come to mind. But let's flip the script and delve into the murky waters of a rather less glamorous topic: the Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. Yes, you heard that right. While they may have been busy raiding monasteries and terrorizing coastal towns, the Vikings also had to contend with the pressing issue of keeping their fish fresh, or at least not rancid. Earliest records: dried fish and the rise of Scandinavian cuisine. Our tale begins in the late 8th century, around 793 AD, when the Viking Age kicked off with a bang, or rather, a splash. The first recorded raid at Lindisfarne, England, marked the beginning of a series of escapades that left a lasting impact on Europe. But amidst the looting and pillaging, Vikings also needed sustenance, and what better way to survive than with dried fish? The practice of drying fish isn't exclusively a Viking innovation, but they certainly perfected it. Cod, a favorite, was put through a rigorous drying process, transforming it from slimy sea creature to preserved protein. Can you imagine the first Viking who thought, hey, let's hang this fish up to dry and see what happens? Sounds like a questionable culinary experiment, doesn't it? But it worked, and by the 10th century, we find records of Viking dried fish storage protocols. The Norse codification of fish storage, a blueprint for rationing. By 1000 AD, as the Vikings were busy establishing settlements in Greenland and Newfoundland, yes, they were the original Canadian tourists, They also created a system for dried fish storage that could only be described as, well, lackluster. What might have been an exciting topic for a Viking council turned into a debate over how many fish could be stored in a longhouse without attracting rats or the ire of the local gods. Basic ration protocols, the fishy fundamentals. 1. Quantity over quality. Each Viking was allotted about 2 to 3 dried cod fillets per week, depending on how generous the local chieftain felt. Why not 4? Because rationing is all about making tough choices, folks. 2. Storage techniques. Fish was stored in burlap sacks, handmade, of course, suspended from the rafters to keep it out of reach of both humans and pests. Did they really believe that fish would magically float up there? Probably. 3. Fermentation frenzy. If you thought dried fish was the end of the line, think again. Some Vikings took the extra step to ferment their fish, creating a delicacy called hakarl. The smell alone would make your stomach churn, but who doesn't love a good fishy challenge? 4. Location, location, location. The ideal storage conditions were cool, dry, and dark, sort of like a teenage boy's bedroom. Fish was typically stored in the cellar or a specially designated fish room. Fancy, right? 5. The fish tax. In some regions, Viking chieftains imposed a tax on the amount of fish stored, encouraging their subjects to keep minimal supplies. Why save for a rainy day when you can pay your taxes instead? Anecdotes from the fish files, absurd practices and shocking discoveries. As we delve deeper into the annals of Viking history, we uncover some shocking anecdotes and curious practices that could only belong to this seafaring bunch. In 988 AD, a Viking named Bjorn, the Fishy, was famously ousted from a raid because he brought along a sack of fermented fish that had gone ahem off. His crewmates, upon opening the sack, fled in terror. They later reported that the sack emitted a scent of doom. Bjorn, however, remained convinced it was a culinary masterpiece, declaring, "It's an acquired taste." A true innovator or simply a man with a terrible sense of smell? In 1030 AD, during an early winter, a group of Vikings decided to host a fish feast to boost morale. Unfortunately, they miscalculated the rationing and ended up serving a single dried cod to 20 men. The ensuing brawl over the fish, known as the cod conflict, resulted in several broken noses and a rather embarrassing retreat. Who knew dried fish could incite such violence? In 1042 AD, a Viking merchant named Freydis began selling premium, dried fish that had been stored in salt and wrapped in cloth for an upscale touch. This was all well and good until it was discovered that the cloth was actually made from his late grandmother's old tunic. Talk about a family recipe. Curious practices, the fishy superstitions of the North. The Vikings had a plethora of fish-related superstitions that would make even the most skeptical among us raise an eyebrow. For instance, it was believed that if you hung a codfish over the door, it would ward off evil spirits. Who needs a bouncer when you have a stinky fish on guard? Moreover, it was customary to perform a fish dance before a fishing expedition, where Vikings would don fish hats and prance around the longhouse. This bizarre ritual was meant to appease the sea gods and ensure a bountiful catch. But let's be real, who wouldn't want to see a group of burly Vikings dancing in fish hats? The decline of dried fish, a sad tale of fishy storage. As Europe transitioned into the late Middle Ages, dried fish began to lose its luster. With the advent of refrigeration and the rise of trade routes, fresh fish became readily available. The Viking methods of fish storage became relics of the past, much like their longships and horned helmets. By the 13th century, the last remnants of Viking dried fish storage protocols were largely forgotten. Ironically, it was the very innovation they had once championed that led to their decline. Can you imagine how the Vikings would react to modern sushi bars? They'd likely invade just to complain about the lack of a good, hearty dried fish. Final thoughts, a legacy of fishy rationing. In conclusion, the history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage is a tale as rich and layered as a well-aged piece of cod. From their early experiments in drying fish to their bizarre rituals and shocking anecdotes, the Vikings certainly made their mark, however lackluster it may have been. So next time you're enjoying a delightful fish dinner, take a moment to ponder the trials and tribulations of those ancient seafarers. They may not have had the best storage protocols, but they sure knew how to turn a lackluster diet into a legendary saga. Who would have thought that the fate of a people could hinge on the whims of fish storage? Now, if only they had thought to make a fishy sitcom, we might have a very different view of their history. #### The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. While the Viking Age, circa 793 to 1066 CE, is often romanticized with tales of longships and fierce raids, the realities of daily life for these Norse seafarers were often more mundane. Among the myriad of challenges they faced, none was as critical, or as surprisingly dull, as the protocols for rationing dried fish storage. This deep dive into the unexciting world of Viking fish management reveals a tapestry woven with construction methods, bureaucratic rules, job roles, and a surprisingly detailed inventory system. ########################################################################################### Construction methods and materials. When it came to storing dried fish, Vikings employed a few construction methods that would make any modern efficiency expert cringe. The primary structure used for storage was the gel, a raised rack or platform typically made from wood. These racks were designed to ensure proper air circulation and sunlight exposure, which were essential for the drying process. Materials: wood, typically from oak or pine, chosen for their durability and availability. Twine, often derived from animal sinews or plant fibers, used to tie fish to the racks. Costs: the cost of constructing a basic gel varied based on local timber prices and the size of the operation. A small family-run drying rack might cost around 2 silver coins, while a larger communal structure could run up to 10 silver coins. Given that a silver coin was worth about a month's wages for a laborer, one can appreciate the stakes involved. As with many Viking innovations, the gel was not just a functional piece of equipment, it was also a testament to the Viking spirit of resourcefulness, though perhaps less exciting than pillaging a monastery. Bureaucratic rules and punishments. The Viking ethos was not solely about raiding, it also involved a surprising degree of social order and regulation, particularly when it came to food sources. It's easy to imagine a council of burly Norsemen arguing over the best fish drying techniques, but in reality, there were bureaucratic rules governing dried fish storage that would make any modern office drone feel right at home. Regulations. All fish caught had to be dried within 24 hours of being caught, lest they spoil. Spoilage was considered a serious offense, as it threatened the food supply. Each village had a designated fiskbond, fish farmer, responsible for overseeing the drying process and ensuring compliance with communal standards. Punishments. Failure to comply with these drying regulations could result in fines or, for repeat offenders, being forced to eat nothing but spoiled fish for a week, a punishment devised by the Thing, local assembly, that was as effective as it was unappetizing. In a society that valued strength and skill, the notion of bureaucratic oversight for fish storage seems almost laughable. Yet, it underscores a fascinating contrast. The Vikings were not merely warriors but also community planners who understood the importance of resource management. Roles and job descriptions. As mentioned, the role of the fiskbond was crucial, but the fish management hierarchy extended beyond this singular title. Below are some of the key roles involved in the dried fish storage process. 1. Fiskbond, fish farmer. Responsibilities: oversaw the drying process, ensured compliance with rules, and managed disputes over fish allocation. Skills required: knowledge of drying techniques, interpersonal skills for conflict resolution, and a nose for spoiled fish. 2. Torker, dryer. Responsibilities: handled the actual drying of fish, ensuring they were properly salted and placed on the gel. Skills required: experience in salting techniques and an eye for weather conditions that could affect drying. 3. Salgsman, salesman. Responsibilities: managed the sale and distribution of dried fish, often at local markets or during trade. Skills required: bargaining skills, knowledge of market prices, and a healthy sense of humor to deal with customers. 4. Lærling, apprentice. Responsibilities: assisted with various tasks, learned the trade, and, most importantly, was often the one tasked with the unglamorous job of cleaning the drying racks. Skills required: a willingness to learn and a strong stomach. The intricate hierarchy of fish storage roles reveals a structured society that, while often painted as brutish, had its own version of the corporate ladder. One could argue, however, that the turnover rate for lærling was astonishingly high. After all, who wants to clean up after a smelly fish? Technical specs and inventories. In a world where dry goods were a lifeline, the Vikings maintained surprisingly detailed inventories of their dried fish stock. The logistics of this process were as essential as they were tedious. Specifications. Rack size: each rack typically measured about 3 meters in length and 1 meter in width, capable of holding around 100 fish at a time. Drying time: Fish typically took about 3 to 5 days to fully dry, depending on the weather conditions. Inventory lists. A standard inventory might include 1. Cod, 200 specimens. 2. Herring, 150 specimens. 3. Salmon, 75 specimens. 4. Miscellaneous, including the occasional mystery fish, 50 specimens. The regular checks of these inventories were handled by the Fiskbond, who would dutifully tally the stock and report any discrepancies at the next village meeting. One could imagine the excitement on Fish Market Day. Today we sold 50 herring, but alas, the mystery fish remains unsold. What a tragedy. Hashtag the importance of dried fish storage protocols. Though one might be tempted to dismiss the Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage as trivial, these practices were, in fact, vital to the survival of Norse communities. Dried fish served as a critical food source during long winters and was an essential trade commodity. The protocols ensured that fish was stored safely, could be rationed effectively, and remained edible for long periods. Furthermore, the organization surrounding fish storage reflected broader social structures. The community relied on these practices to maintain order and ensure everyone had their fair share of nourishment. The regulations may have seemed dull, but they were a linchpin in the daily lives of the Vikings, akin to the modern-day supply chain logistics that keep our grocery stores stocked. Conclusion. As we peer through the mists of time to examine the lackluster yet essential history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage, we uncover a narrative that is both mundane and profoundly significant. The construction methods, bureaucratic rules, job descriptions, technical specifications, and inventory management reveal a society that, while often characterized by its warrior ethos, was equally concerned with effective resource management. So, the next time you enjoy a piece of dried fish, be it a snack or a culinary delight, consider the long-forgotten protocols that ensured it reached your plate. Perhaps, in some small way, you might even raise a glass in honor of the Fiskbond and his merry band of fish-drying apprentices, who, let's be honest, deserved a hearty meal after all that drying and cleaning. After all, no one ever wrote a saga about the excitement of rationing, but perhaps they should have. The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. Introduction. The Vikings. Renowned for their seafaring prowess, fearsome raids, and a penchant for pillaging. Yet, behind the horned helmets and fearsome longships lies a less glamorous, albeit essential, aspect of their daily lives, the art of dried fish storage and the protocols for rationing this vital resource. While the sagas tell tales of glorious conquests, they barely scratched the surface of the bureaucratic labyrinth that governed the humble dried fish. So, let us dive into this murky historical sea, where the fish was plentiful but the protocols were decidedly less than thrilling. Construction methods and materials, 800 AD, 1000 AD. The Viking penchant for practicality extended to their methods of fish preservation. By the late 8th century, they had developed a rudimentary yet effective system for drying fish, primarily cod, a staple of their diet. Construction techniques *. 1. Drying racks, or fish stands, made from local timber. These racks were constructed using vertical posts with crossbeams. Materials, typically oak or birch, chosen for their durability and resistance to rot. The cost was relatively low, as timber was abundant. Time frame, about 3 days to construct a basic drying rack, depending on the number of fish to be processed. 2. Smokehouses. For those who preferred a smoked flavor or needed additional preservation, smokehouses were integral. Materials, stone and wood were used, with the smoke generated from burning birch or juniper. The costs varied, depending on the need for extra materials like clay for sealing. Time frame, construction took up to a week, with ongoing maintenance required to keep the structure functional. Cost analysis. A basic drying rack could be built for approximately 5 silver coins, while a smokehouse might set a clan back 20 coins, a significant investment given the fluctuating economy of the Viking Age. ##### Bureaucratic rules and punishments, 900 AD. As with any society, the Vikings developed a set of bureaucratic rules governing the operation of their fish storage protocols. These were often codified in local laws and overseen by a jarl or local chieftain. Key regulations. 1. Storage limits. Each family was permitted to store a maximum of 200 dried fish per household, a number determined by the local assembly, thing. Exceeding this limit drew the ire of the community. 2. Rationing protocols. During lean times, such as harsh winters or failed fishing seasons, rationing became critical. The local chieftain would oversee the distribution of dried fish based on family needs, size, and contributions to the community. 3. Inspections. Regular inspections were mandated to ensure compliance with storage limits and quality control. A local enforcer, often referred to as the fish warden, was charged with this duty. Punishments for non-compliance. Fines. Families exceeding storage limits faced fines of 10 silver coins or a portion of their excess fish. Public shaming. Those found hoarding fish were subjected to public ridicule, often being paraded through the village with a sign declaring their crime, the fish hoarder. Now, imagine being a Viking, known for valiant raids, only to have your legacy reduced to being the fish hoarder. Talk about a legacy with a fishy aftertaste. #### roles and job descriptions, 850 AD, 1000 AD. In the intricate world of Viking dried fish storage, several key roles emerged, each with specific responsibilities and expectations. 1. Fish warden, the enforcer of the fish storage protocols. Responsibilities: conduct inspections, enforce limits, and oversee distribution during rationing. Qualifications: must be well respected in the community, with a keen sense of smell, essential for detecting spoiled fish. 2. Fish dryer, the artisan responsible for the actual drying process. Responsibilities: construct drying racks, monitor the drying process, and ensure quality. Qualifications: must possess skills in carpentry and a nose for freshness, because no one wants to eat fish that smells like last week's raid. 3. Ration distributor, a role often filled by the eldest matron of a household. Responsibilities: distribute dried fish to family members and ensure fair rationing. Qualifications: must have excellent organizational skills and the ability to mediate disputes, especially when it comes to who ate the last piece of dried fish. 4. Fish trader, for those who engaged in commerce, trading dried fish was a lucrative business. Responsibilities: negotiate trade deals, transport fish, and maintain inventory. Qualifications: must be persuasive and quick-thinking, especially when bartering with rival clans. ##### Technical specs and inventories, 1000 AD. The Vikings, while not known for their advanced technology, did have some rudimentary methods of inventory management regarding their dried fish supplies. Technical specifications. 1. Dried fish dimensions. Average size per fish was about 2 to 3 feet long. Fish were typically cut, cleaned, and laid flat on drying racks. 2. Storage containers. Dried fish was often stored in woven baskets made from reeds or birch bark. Capacity. A standard basket could hold approximately 30 dried fish. 3. Temperature control. The ideal drying temperature ranged from 20 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius, 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Fish were dried outdoors in the sun and wind, with the occasional use of smoke from the smokehouses. Inventory management. Monthly counts. Fish wardens conducted monthly counts of stored fish, requiring meticulous record keeping. Quality checks. Each batch was examined for spoilage, with a strict policy that any spoiled fish must be discarded immediately, thus preventing the dreaded stink of shame. Conclusion. As we conclude our deep dive into the drab yet necessary world of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage, it becomes clear that the Vikings were not just warriors but also pioneers of resource management. Their bureaucratic systems, while lacking the flair of epic battles, were vital to their survival in a world where the seasons dictated life and death. So, while the sagas extol the virtues of bravery and adventure, let us not forget the unsung heroes, the fish wardens, the diligent dryers, and the rationing matriarchs who balanced the scales of survival. After all, in a world where every fish counts, even the smallest actions can make waves, unless, of course, they're dried fish, in which case they've already made their way to a cozy stew or a hearty meal. Who knew that behind every Viking raid lay a tale of rationing, storage, and bureaucratic fishiness? The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from 793 to 1066 AD, is often romanticized for its fierce warriors, adventurous seafarers, and epic sagas. However, lurking beneath this veneer of excitement lies a less glamorous truth. The Vikings, despite their fearsome reputation, had to grapple with the mundane challenges of food storage and rationing. Among the most significant of these challenges was the storage of dried fish, a staple in their diet. The protocols surrounding this essential foodstuff reveal a lackluster history marked by rudimentary construction methods, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and an array of roles that would make even the most seasoned office worker groan. #### Construction methods and materials. 1. Fishing and drying techniques, circa 800–1100 AD. The Vikings relied primarily on cod, herring, and other fish. They employed a straightforward yet effective method of drying fish. After catching, fish were cleaned and eviscerated, then hung on wooden racks or laid out on stones to dry in the open air. Materials used: the racks were typically made from timber harvested from nearby forests and were often constructed using basic joinery techniques. The wood was often untreated, which made for a rather aromatic end product, if by aromatic you mean the olfactory equivalent of a long-forgotten gym bag. 2. Storage facilities. Once dried, the fish needed to be stored properly. Large wooden chests called kistas were constructed to house the dried fish. Costs: the construction of these chests was relatively low, as timber was abundant. However, the craftsmanship varied, leading to a range of quality. Those that were poorly constructed often led to a feast of mold instead of fish. 3. Environmental considerations. Vikings, being keen observers of nature, understood the importance of ventilation and elevation. They often stored their fish above ground to avoid moisture and pests, although this did little to deter the ravenous seagulls, which were apparently the Vikings' natural nemesis. #### Bureaucratic rules and punishments. 1. Regulatory framework. The Vikings had an informal set of guidelines regarding fish storage and rationing. These were not codified in the sense we understand today but were passed down orally. A village leader, or gwa, often enforced these rules. Punishments for non-compliance: if a household failed to comply with the community's drying and storage methods, they could face fines or, in extreme cases, social ostracism. This meant that the next time they were in a pickle, perhaps a pickled herring, their neighbors might not be so keen on sharing. 2. Quality control. Fish that was deemed unfit for storage could be subject to a re-evaluation process, which involved a panel of local elders who would sniff, poke, and prod the fish to determine its fate. The old adage, "one man's fish is another man's poison," probably originated in these council meetings. 3. Documentation. Despite the lack of formal records, informal notes and runes on wooden tablets indicated the amount of dried fish stored and the time period for which it was intended. If only the Vikings had invented Excel, imagine the spreadsheets. #### Roles and job descriptions. 1. Fishers. Primary role: responsible for catching fish and ensuring that they were prepared for drying. Job specs: must possess strong arms for casting nets and a keen sense of timing to avoid storms. Always on the lookout for the local seagull, who might be plotting to raid the catch. 2. Drying overseers, or dreyferi. Primary role: in charge of overseeing the drying process, ensuring fish were hung properly and rotated for even drying. Job specs: must possess a keen sense of smell and a knack for organization, as well as an alarming ability to recognize mold before it becomes a serious issue. 3. Storage managers. Primary role, responsible for the proper storage of dried fish, including inventory and rotation. Job specs, must have a good memory and an eye for detail, as the penalties for mismanagement could lead to a bitterly hungry winter for the community. Hashtag technical specs and inventories. 1. Storage capacities. Typical storage facilities could hold between 200 to 500 fish, depending on the size of the village and its resources. Inventory listings. Dried cod, 300 pieces. Herring, 150 pieces. Mackerel, 50 pieces. Unidentified fish, likely a failed experiment, 75 pieces. 2. Rationing protocols. The Vikings operated on a rudimentary rationing system, often splitting the dried fish into portions that would last a family throughout the winter months. During harsh winters, the community might rely heavily on fish, leading to a delicate balance between consumption and conservation. Witty aside, if a Viking ever complained about the fish on the table, they were likely told, "Well, it's either this or boiled boots." 3. Seasonal adjustments. The drying and storage of fish varied seasonally. During summer, the focus was on drying as much fish as possible, while winter was often reserved for rationing and consumption. Technical note: the ideal moisture content for dried fish was about 20%, which was a constant source of contention among the drying overseers who insisted they could smell the difference. Hashtag conclusion. In summary, the Viking protocols for dried fish storage and rationing were not the heroic tales of conquest and adventure typically associated with their legacy. Instead, they reveal a society grappling with the mundane realities of food preservation amidst the harsh climate of Scandinavia. The construction methods employed were basic yet effective, while the bureaucratic rules were a patchwork of local customs and practices, often enforced with a mix of humor and harshness. The roles and job descriptions, while mundane, were essential to the community's survival, reflecting an intricate social structure that valued cooperation and resource management. Despite the lackluster nature of these protocols, they played a crucial role in the Vikings' ability to thrive in a challenging environment. So, the next time you think of Vikings, remember that behind the warriors and the sagas lay a world of fishy business, where every dried cod and herring was a testament to their tenacity and resilience. And if you're ever in a Scandinavian village and spot a wooden chest labeled, "dried fish," open at your own risk. Just remember, it's probably best left unopened, unless you fancy a taste of history. The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. The Vikings, a people renowned for their seafaring prowess, their fierce raids, and, let's not forget, their rather uninspired methods of rationing and storing dried fish. While their longships and battle tactics might have been the talk of the fjords, their approach to dried fish storage could be best described as lackluster, at best. As we delve into the intricacies of their protocols, it becomes clear that the Vikings had a complicated relationship with their fish, one that involved a lot of salt, a dash of bureaucracy, and a smattering of job descriptions that would make any modern HR manager weep. #### construction methods, materials, and costs. Let's start with the backbone of Viking fish storage, construction methods and materials. Dried fish, primarily cod, was an essential part of the Viking diet and a significant commodity for trade. The process for storing it was not as straightforward as simply leaving fish out to dry in the sun. From the late 8th century onward, Vikings employed various methods to ensure the longevity of their prized catch. The primary construction materials for drying racks were timber, often sourced from local trees such as pine and birch. The racks, known as fisker, were typically built in open-air locations, allowing for optimal sunlight and airflow. A standard fish rack would measure approximately 6 feet in height and 10 feet in length, allowing for ample space to hang filleted fish. The cost of constructing these racks was relatively low, estimated at around 2 to 3 silver coins per structure, depending on wood availability and the skill of the craftsman involved. The fish itself, once caught, would be salted in large barrels made from oak, another common material. Salt was an expensive commodity, often sourced from trade with the Celts or obtained through labor-intensive processes involving evaporation of seawater. The cost of salt fluctuated, but during the Viking Age, it could reach up to 5 silver coins per barrel, making it a precious resource in the fish preservation process. #### bureaucratic rules and punishments. Now, what would a Viking endeavor be without a smattering of bureaucracy? The rationing protocols for dried fish storage were governed by a set of unwritten rules that varied from one settlement to another. However, some overarching principles were largely accepted. By the late 900s, the Viking Age had witnessed the establishment of local councils, known as things, where laws and regulations were discussed. All matters related to fish storage fell under the jurisdiction of these assemblies. The rules were fairly straightforward. 1. Rationing limits. Each household was permitted to store a maximum of 200 fish per season. This limit aimed to prevent overstocking, which would lead to spoilage and waste. 2. Inspection protocols. Every spring, designated inspectors, often the local chieftain's son, much to his chagrin, would conduct fish inspections. If a household exceeded the limit, the excess fish would be confiscated and redistributed to the needy. 3. Salt quotas. Households were required to keep detailed records of their salt usage. Excessive salt was frowned upon, as it indicated a lack of resourcefulness. Punishments for overuse included fines or, in severe cases, a short stint in the stocks, an all too frequent punishment for those who took their fish storage too liberally. In a true demonstration of Viking ingenuity, one could argue that the bureaucratic system was as robust as a longship, though it lacked the finesse of their maritime technology. It's a wonder they managed to sail to distant shores while keeping their fish storage protocols in check. #### roles and job descriptions. With a system as convoluted as this, a variety of roles emerged to ensure the proper functioning of dried fish storage. Here are a few key positions that played a crucial part in the process. 1. Fisherman, the backbone of the operation. fishermen were responsible for catching the fish. They employed long lines and nets, and their success was vital to the community's food supply. Fishermen typically worked in teams, with each member assigned specific tasks: casting nets, hauling in catches, or preparing fish for drying. 2. Salt Master. A highly respected position, the Salt Master was in charge of overseeing the acquisition and distribution of salt. This role required a keen understanding of trade dynamics, as the Salt Master often negotiated with traders from distant lands. They also maintained records of salt usage, ensuring households adhered to their quotas. 3. Drying Rack Supervisor. This individual was tasked with managing the drying process. They ensured that fish were hung correctly to maximize airflow and prevent spoilage. A keen eye was necessary, as the supervisor had to monitor the weather and adjust drying times accordingly. 4. Inspector. Appointed by the local thing, inspectors were responsible for enforcing the rationing protocols. Their job included conducting inspections of fish storage areas and ensuring compliance with salt quotas. They were often viewed with a mix of respect and trepidation. After all, no one wanted to face the wrath of the local chieftain. 5. Fishmonger. Once the fish was dried and ready for trade, the fishmonger took over. They were responsible for selling the dried fish in local markets or trading it with neighboring communities. A good fishmonger could make a fortune, especially during the harsh winter months when fresh food was scarce. In the grand scheme of Viking society, these roles created a complex web of interdependence, with each position relying on the others for success. One might say it was a fishy version of a modern-day supply chain, albeit with fewer spreadsheets and more swords. #### technical specs and inventories. Now, let's dive into the technical specifications and inventories involved in fish storage. The Vikings were nothing if not practical, so their storage methods were grounded in functionality. Drying techniques. The fish were typically split and salted before being hung on drying racks. The racks were spaced to allow for air circulation, and the fish were often layered with salt to enhance preservation. Storage conditions. Ideal storage conditions required a dry, cool environment. Houses were often equipped with specific storage areas, known as fiskageller, designed for fish storage. The temperature was ideally kept between 10 to 15 degrees Celsius to prevent spoilage, and humidity levels were monitored. Inventory management. Households typically maintained a simple inventory system using wooden tally sticks. Each notch represented a fish, and households would often mark their sticks during inspections. This rudimentary bookkeeping was crucial during audits, as it ensured that everyone adhered to the rationing protocols. Quantities and measurements. A typical Viking household would consume approximately 300 dried fish per winter. Given that fish could last for several months if properly dried, careful management was essential. Losing even a few pieces to spoilage could mean the difference between survival and starvation. #### The final thought. In conclusion, the Viking protocols for dried fish storage were a reflection of their resourcefulness and adaptability. Despite the lackluster nature of their methods, these practices played a vital role in their sustenance and trade. From the construction of drying racks to the enforcement of bureaucratic regulations, the Vikings navigated the complexities of food preservation with creativity, humor, and perhaps a touch of salt. While the world remembers them for their fierce raids and impressive longships, it's only fitting that we acknowledge their rather unimpressive yet essential approach to fish storage. After all, even the fiercest of warriors need to eat, preferably without the threat of spoiled fish. In the end, one must wonder, if Viking warriors had better fish storage protocols, might they have spent less time raiding and more time enjoying a good meal? Alas, such questions may remain unanswered, lost to the currents of time. ### The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. Ah, the Vikings! Those brawny Norsemen are often remembered for their epic sea voyages, their knack for pillaging, and, let's not forget, their questionable fashion choices. Yet lurking beneath the glimmer of their helmets and the sheen of their battle axes lies the dull but surprisingly intricate world of dried fish storage. Yes, you heard that right. While you might be imagining grand longships sailing through stormy seas, the Vikings were also grappling with the less-than-glamorous reality of rationing protocols. So let's dive into this murky, salty sea of history, where we'll uncover the regional variations, laws, logistics, and even a grotesque anecdote or two. Anchors away. ### Regional variations, the salt of the earth. First off, let's talk about the regional variations in dried fish storage. If you think the Vikings were a homogeneous bunch, think again. From Norway's fjords to the windswept shores of Iceland, the methods for drying and storing fish were as diverse as the hairstyles of the chieftains. In Norway, where the cod were practically begging to be caught, the drying method involved hanging the fish on wooden racks, where they would dangle like a macabre fishy chandelier. This method, known as klippfisk, involved air-drying cod for weeks, yes, weeks, until they resembled something one might find in a particularly ambitious Halloween display. The locals then stored this treasure in wooden barrels, sometimes with layers of salt for good measure. Because nothing says delicious quite like a fish that could double as a doorstop, am I right? Now, venture over to Iceland, where the climate is not exactly known for its hospitality. The Vikings here had to get creative. They would dry fish in the fierce winds, leading to a method called harfisker. It was so hard, in fact, that one might mistake it for a medieval weapon. This method produced a product that could last for years, which was great news for anyone embarking on an 8-month journey to raid the British Isles. Who wouldn't want to gnaw on a chunk of what could only be described as jerky gone wrong, while plotting their next conquest? ### Laws, edicts, and taxes, the Codfish Code. Next, let's swim into the murky waters of Viking laws and edicts regarding dried fish, because, believe it or not, even the Vikings had rules about how to store their fish. It wasn't all plundering and pillaging, they had a code of conduct, albeit one that revolved around the storage of their most prized protein source. The legislative landscape was as rocky as a Norse coastline. In the 10th century, King Harald Fairhair of Norway issued edicts that regulated the trade and storage of dried fish. The laws were designed to ensure that no Viking would starve in the middle of a raid due to poor fish management. Imagine being the poor soul who gets caught storing his dried fish improperly and is then subjected to the public shaming of having to eat it in front of his peers. Talk about a fate worse than death. Local taxes also played a role in the fishy business. In some regions, fish storage was taxed based on the quantity stored. So, if you were a Viking with a penchant for hoarding fish like a dragon guards gold, you'd better be prepared to shell out some serious silver. Enter the ledger keepers, the unsung heroes of Viking society, who recorded every single fish, barrel, and tax payment with the diligence of a librarian on caffeine. Their meticulous record-keeping ensured that every dried fish was accounted for, which would put even modern-day accountants to shame. Hashtag logistics and supply chains, the fishy highway. Now let's unpack the logistics of this whole dried fish operation. You might envision a bustling Viking marketplace where fish were traded like currency, but the reality was a complicated web of supply chains. These weren't just any fish, they were precious commodities that could make or break a raid, or a winter, depending on how well they were stored. Transporting dried fish wasn't as simple as tossing it into a longship and calling it a day. No. The Vikings had to consider the tides, the winds, and the possibility of angry sea monsters. Fish were transported in barrels, which, as history would have it, were not always watertight. So, if you thought you were getting a barrel full of dried cod, you might just end up with a soggy disappointment. In addition to transport, the Vikings had to deal with storage issues. Dried fish was often stored near the hearth during the winter months to keep it from freezing solid, which is definitely not the ideal fish storage environment. Imagine reaching for a piece of fish only to find it rock solid and as unyielding as a stubborn block of ice. Let's be honest. No one wants to wrestle with a stubborn fish when they're just trying to whip up a quick stew. Hashtag record keeping, the fishy chronicles. As we delve deeper into the thrilling world of record keeping, one might wonder how the Vikings managed to keep track of their fishy inventory. The answer: with the same fervor and precision that one might expect from a modern-day grocery store manager. The Viking sagas, while filled with tales of glory, occasionally dip into the mundane details of fish storage, like the time Bjorn the Bold lamented over his dwindling supply of dried herring. Ancient ledgers were often inscribed on wooden tablets or in the margins of sagas, with meticulous notes about which fishermen caught what, how many barrels were stored, and when the next fish festival would take place. You could practically hear the ink scratching away as the scribes recorded every fishy transaction, all while trying to keep the more exciting tales of adventure from overshadowing their dry, pun intended, accounting. One particularly entertaining ledger entry from the year 991 details an instance where a certain Olav the Unfortunate managed to misplace an entire shipment of dried fish destined for the king. Instead of a triumphant delivery, Olav arrived empty-handed, and the king was reportedly less than impressed. The ledger reads, "Olav shall henceforth be known as the Hungry, for he brought only shame upon his house." A tale that reminds us that even the most fearsome Viking could fall victim to what we now call logistical errors. Hashtag a grotesque anecdote, fishy fiascos. Now, brace yourselves for the piece de resistance, a borderline grotesque anecdote involving dried fish that may just leave you reeling. Legend has it that during the long winter of 1030, a band of Vikings found themselves with a surplus of dried fish, thanks to a particularly bountiful catch. However, rather than celebrate, they faced a dire predicament, a rat infestation in their storage area. The Vikings, not ones to waste resources, decided to take matters into their own hands. They set a trap, an elaborate contraption involving a barrel, some fish, and a very disgruntled seagull. The plan was to lure the rats away with a feast worthy of Valhalla. What they didn't anticipate was that the seagull, feeling particularly peckish, would take a liking to the bait. This led to a chaotic scene of Vikings chasing a squawking bird, while the rats, sensing the commotion, feasted on the very fish meant for the feast. In a twist of fate that could only happen in a Viking settlement, the Vikings ended up with neither fish nor fowl. The rats thrived, and the seagull, now the stuff of legends, became a symbol of what happens when you let your fishy affairs go unchecked. So, the next time you think about dried fish storage, just remember this cautionary tale. It's not just about keeping your fish fresh, it's about keeping your entire household intact. Hashtag conclusion, a fishy legacy. So there you have it, the lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. From regional variations and legalities to logistics and record keeping, it turns out that even the fiercest warriors had to grapple with the mundane details of their fishy inventory. As you ponder the complexities of Viking life, remember that behind every glorious raid and epic saga lies the unsung hero of dried fish storage, an aspect of history that may not get the glory it deserves but is, nonetheless, a fascinating chapter in the saga of the North. After all, even the mightiest Viking needed to eat, and sometimes, that meant wrestling with a barrel of rock-hard fish. So the next time you're enjoying a nice piece of fish, raise a glass to the Vikings and their less-than-glamorous fishy legacy. The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. Ah, the Vikings, a bold bunch of seafaring marauders, renowned for their fearsome longships, impressive horned helmets, which, let's be honest, were likely a myth, and a penchant for pillaging. But behind the brawn and the pillaging lies a rather mundane, yet oddly fascinating, history of dried fish storage. Yes, you heard that right. They didn't just raid and rave, they also rationed and recorded. Let's take a deep dive into the murky waters of Viking rationing protocols, a tale that's equal parts thrilling and, dare I say it, lackluster. Hashtag regional variations over time. Picture this, a Viking chieftain, possibly with a name like Ragnar the Reluctant, standing atop a hill, surveying his domain. Below him, the clans are bustling, but not with the sound of axes clashing or shields clanging. No, they are busy arguing over how best to store dried fish. You see, not all Vikings were created equal when it came to fish preservation. Depending on whether you were in Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, the methods and protocols for dried fish storage varied like the flavors of a Viking feast, somewhat bland but occasionally spiced up with a hint of controversy. In Norway, for instance, the fish were often dried using a technique known as hjortekjat, which, despite sounding like a medieval spell, merely means dried meat, where fish were suspended on wooden frames and left to air out. Meanwhile, in Denmark, they had a penchant for salt. Lots of it. Salted fish was the name of the game there, leading to a rather salty disposition among Norsemen, both literally and metaphorically. Over time, as the Vikings spread their longships across the seas, these regional quirks began to mingle. Imagine a fish market in a bustling Viking port, where a Norwegian trader and a Danish merchant haggle over fish samples. "Ah, but this one is too dry," the Norwegian scoffs. "And this one is too salty," retorts the Dane. It's a culinary clash that would have made an excellent reality TV show, Survivor, Viking edition, perhaps. #### laws, edicts, taxes, and ledgers. Now, if you thought the Vikings were all about swords and sorcery, think again. They also had a flair for the bureaucratic. Yes, folks, you heard me right. Viking society had laws and edicts regarding dried fish storage, and they were more serious than a Norse god judging a meat-drinking contest. In 1319, King Haakon VI of Norway issued a royal edict specifically aimed at regulating fish storage. This was not just a casual suggestion, it was a full-blown decree that specified how much fish each household must store, how to prepare it, and even how to keep pesky rodents away from their prized catch. Let it be known, the edict proclaimed, that any household found hoarding more than their fair share shall face the wrath of the gods. And the taxes. Oh, the taxes. There was a tax specifically levied on salted fish, known as the sildaskatt, herring tax. This tax was a source of endless complaints among the Viking populace, but it did ensure that the fish supply chain remained afloat, pun intended. Vikings would keep meticulous ledgers to record their stock, which included listings such as 20 barrels of herring, 10 barrels of cod, and 2 barrels of "what the hell is this?" ### logistics and supply chains. Let's not forget the logistics of this whole fish business. The Vikings were not just pillagers, they were also surprisingly savvy about supply chains. Imagine a Viking ship, laden with dried fish, navigating the treacherous waters of the North Sea. The captain, let's call him Sigurd the Stealthy, would have had to plan every detail meticulously. He had to consider the weather, the winds, and, most importantly, the availability of fresh water for his crew. After all, nobody wants to be stuck in a ship full of dried fish with a crew thirsting for something other than the fishy aroma lingering in the air. Ahoy, lads! Keep your spirits high, and your thirst quenched. Sigurd would shout, handing out rations of dried fish like a jolly old Santa Claus, but with a lot more grit and a lot less cheer. Viking supply chains were also influenced by their raids. After a successful raid on a coastal village, the spoils would include not just gold and silver, but also valuable fish stocks. A clever Viking chief might even negotiate with local fishermen to trade weapons for their finest catches. You see, my good man, while your fish is fresh, our swords are sharper. Hashtag record keeping with lots of specifics. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the Vikings' dedication to record keeping, particularly when it came to their precious fish. They kept detailed records of what they caught, what they stored, and how long they could expect their dried fish to last before it became more inedible than a week-old meat. For example, one ledger from the late 10th century details the drying times for various types of fish: cod, 5 to 7 days, herring, 3 to 5 days, mystery fish, 2 days, proceed with caution. The Vikings even had a rudimentary form of inventory management, noting when fish stocks were running low and when it was time to restock. Each entry was written in runes that seemed to say, yes, we may be fierce warriors, but we are also fish accountants. And let's not forget the tantalizing specifics regarding storage conditions. It was crucial to keep the fish in a cool, dry place, preferably away from the sun and, more importantly, away from pesky rodents. No rat shall feast on our fish, they would declare, likely while shaking their fists at the sky in anger. Hashtag one surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. Now, as we meander through this generally mundane history of Viking fish storage, we must touch upon one rather surprising, and borderline grotesque, anecdote that has somehow slipped through the annals of time. Gather round, dear readers, for this is a tale that may make your stomach churn and your nose wrinkle. Legend has it that during a particularly harsh winter in 970 AD, a group of Vikings found themselves stranded on a remote island with nothing but their dried fish rations. As the days turned into weeks, desperation set in. Supplies were running low, and the weather was not cooperating. To make matters worse, they had a particularly pungent batch of fermented fish that had reached a level of odor so potent it could knock a hound off its feet. In a fit of madness, one Viking, let's call him Olaf the Outrageous, proposed a solution. Why not eat the fish that has gone bad? It is still fish, after all. The rest of the crew, initially horrified, eventually succumbed to their hunger. What followed was an epic feast of fermented fish, which they dubbed the Last Supper of Stinky Fish. The aftermath was something out of a Norse nightmare. Let's just say that the island was not only devoid of fresh fish for weeks but also left with a lingering odor that even the fiercest storms could not wash away. The surviving Vikings returned home with tales of bravery, but they also carried with them a reputation for being the smelliest raiders to ever sail the seas. Hashtag conclusion. And there you have it, the lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. Beneath the surface of their fierce reputation was a society that grappled with the mundane aspects of survival, from laws and edicts to logistics and record-keeping. While they are often remembered for their raids and conquests, it's equally important to recognize their dedication to the art of fish storage, a feat that may not have been as thrilling as a sword fight, but was just as essential for survival. So, the next time you find yourself eyeing a plate of dried fish, spare a thought for the Vikings. They may have been known for their bloodthirsty ways, but they were also the original fish rationers. Who knew that the path to glory was paved with meticulous record-keeping and the occasional whiff of fermented fish? Scow. The Lackluster History of Viking Rationing Protocols for Dried Fish Storage. The Vikings. Those brutish seafarers who have graced our imaginations with their horned helmets, pillaging, and a penchant for meat-fueled revelry. But behind the glorious facade of longships and epic sagas lies a world of mundane concerns, namely, the rather lackluster protocols for rationing dried fish storage. Yes, while they may have stormed castles and looted treasures, their culinary logistics were a veritable saga of salt and stench worthy of its own epic. #### Regional variations over time. Let us start by acknowledging that the Viking world was not a monolithic entity. Much like your uncle's fish fry recipe that varies wildly from region to region, Viking dried fish storage practices differ depending on which fjord you hailed from. In the colder climes of Norway, where the winter sun barely bothers to show its face, the drying of fish became a veritable art form. Cod was strung up on wooden racks, air-dried until it resembled a cross between a piece of driftwood and a protein bar from a survivalist's pantry. The Norwegians, blessed with an abundance of cod, had a penchant for what they called klippfisk, a dried fish so hard it could double as a doorstop. Meanwhile, in Denmark, the fish was not just dried, it was fermented into something resembling a science experiment gone awry, known as surströmming. If there's one thing we can learn from this, it's that the Vikings were committed to making fish as unappetizing as possible. Further south in the British Isles, the Vikings made a splash, pun intended, with their pickled herring. The Irish, who were less keen on drying fish and more on drying out in the sun, had their own storage methods, ones that involved less salt and more luck. They figured that if they left the fish long enough, it would either cure itself or turn into a new species. Either way, it was a win-win. #### laws, edicts, taxes, ledgers. The delightful bureaucracy of the Viking Age. You might envision these rugged warriors brandishing axes and shields, but they also had to navigate the labyrinthine laws governing fish storage. Yes, folks, the Viking Age wasn't all about pillaging, it was also about paperwork. Laws regarding fish storage were as intricate as a Viking longship's carvings. The famous King Harald Fairhair, who unified Norway in the 9th century, decreed that any household that failed to produce adequately dried fish would be subjected to a tax that could only be paid in the form of more dried fish. Talk about a vicious cycle. This law, known as the Dried Fish Decree, mandated that every Viking household maintain a minimum stockpile of dried fish lest they face the wrath of the king, an edict that could turn even the most fearsome warrior into a fishmonger overnight. The Viking Age was also a time of ledger-keeping that would make even the most fastidious accountant weep with joy. Skalds, the poets, would pen ballads celebrating fish storage practices, while local chieftains kept meticulous records of their dried fish inventories. These ledgers often included the species of fish, the drying methods employed, and the precise number of fish racks maintained. Yes, the Vikings were as serious about their dried fish as they were about their conquests. In fact, one particularly ambitious ledger from the year 874 lists over 3,000 dried herring, more than enough to feed a small village or perhaps a ravenous horde of warriors post-raid. Hashtag logistics and supply chains. Now, you might be wondering how the Vikings managed to transport all this dried fish across their vast territories. The answer lies in the surprisingly sophisticated logistics and supply chains that would make modern-day logistics companies green with envy. With their longships, the Vikings could navigate rivers and coastlines, transporting their salted and dried fish from one settlement to another. It was a veritable fish highway. Imagine the excitement of a Viking crew as they unloaded their latest catch at the bustling market of York, only to find that the herring had taken on a personality of its own during the journey. Fish were stored in barrels that were often made from the very same trees the Vikings had felled decades earlier to build their ships, because why waste a good tree when it can serve dual purposes? The barrels were lined with layers of salt, creating an almost protective barrier for the fish within. However, this led to a peculiar phenomenon known as barrel rot, where the barrels would become so saturated with brine that they would literally begin to dissolve. The only thing more disheartening than finding out your fish has spoiled is realizing that you now have to replace the barrel as well. Hashtag record keeping with lots of specifics. When it came to record keeping, Vikings were nothing if not thorough. They could tell you the exact number of dried fish in their possession, the method of drying used, and even how many fish the neighbor had dried before their last raid. One famous record from a settlement known as Fish Haven, yes, that's what they called it, details the drying methods of 17 different species of fish, including a variety of unspeakably unpalatable options. The documentation was often done in runes, which, let's be honest, is a bit pretentious for grocery lists. But it worked. One ledger, discovered in a well-worn cave, reveals that the local fishmonger had a stockpile that included 50 cod, 20 mackerel, and 10 unidentifiable fish that had been left to dry for so long they had developed a new ecosystem. If that's not the epitome of resourcefulness, I don't know what is. These records allowed for a level of fish distribution that was astonishing for the era. Town meetings would often devolve into heated debates over who had the best fish storage practices, with each party armed with their ledger filled with proof of their superiority. Imagine a Viking version of a farmer's market, but with much more shouting and significantly less organic kale. Hashtag one surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. Now, prepare yourselves for a rather grotesque tale that may make you rethink the Viking ideal. Picture this: a band of Vikings returns from a successful raid, having plundered not just gold and silver but also an impressive haul of dried fish. Celebrating their victory, they decide to feast. But instead of indulging in the sumptuous dried cod, they accidentally stumble upon a barrel of rotten fish that had been forgotten in the back of a storage shed. What followed was a scene that could only be described as a gastronomic game of Russian roulette. One brave soul, emboldened by mead and the thrill of victory, took the first bite, only to be met with a wall of odor that could knock a troll off its feet. Instead of being deterred, his comrades egged him on, and soon, a contest emerged: who could eat the most of this rancid delicacy? Believe it or not, this contest continued for hours, with warriors vomiting and laughing hysterically, all while proclaiming their undying love for fish. The event culminated with the whole crew collapsing in a heap, reeking of fermented fish and feeling victorious. This bizarre escapade led to the establishment of a new tradition, the annual Rancid Fish Festival, where Vikings would gather to celebrate the spirit of adventure, with a little less emphasis on hygiene. Conclusion. So there you have it. The Vikings, those fearsome raiders of yore, were not just warriors, they were also master fishmongers with a flair for the dramatic and a penchant for the grotesque. Their lackluster history of rationing protocols surrounding dried fish storage may not fill the pages of epic sagas, but it tells a tale of resourcefulness, bureaucracy, and a level of determination to make even the most unappetizing fish palatable. Next time you think of the Vikings, don't just picture the pillaging and plundering. Imagine them hunched over barrels of fish, arguing about the merits of different drying techniques, and maybe even celebrating their culinary misadventures with a hearty laugh. After all, if they could turn dried fish into an art form, who's to say we can't find humor in the mundane? The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. When we think of Vikings, we conjure images of fearsome warriors with horned helmets, which, let's be honest, they didn't actually wear, pillaging coastal towns and feasting on roasted boar. But lurking beneath the surface of their legendary exploits lies a rather dull and soggy topic: the intricacies of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. Yes, that's right. In a world of sagas and seafaring tales, the Vikings also had to grapple with the mundane yet essential logistics of storing their fish. And not just any fish, mind you, but dried fish, which, if we're being brutally honest, is about as appetizing as a pair of old boots after a rainstorm. Hashtag regional variations over time. The Vikings were not a monolithic band of marauders, they were a patchwork of cultures spread across Scandinavia, each with its own quirky take on dried fish. You might think that once you've dried a fish, you've dried a fish, right? Wrong. The Norwegians, for example, were known for their particularly salty methods of preservation, which could make even the most seasoned sailor question his life choices. On the other hand, the Icelanders had a penchant for fermenting their fish, which led to a delicacy known as hakarl. Yes, that's right. What was once just a dried fish was now a pungent, fermented experience that could knock a dragon off its feet. As Viking settlements evolved from the 8th century to the 11th, so too did their fish storage practices. In the earlier days, the dried fish was haphazardly stored in whatever crevice was handy, often resulting in a smorgasbord of varying qualities. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and suddenly we have laws governing the proper stacking of cod. That's right, Viking law codes included edicts like, "Thou shalt not stack thy fish higher than 3 paces, lest the odor offend the gods." This may be an exaggeration, but you get the idea. Hashtag laws, edicts, taxes, ledgers. Speaking of laws, the Vikings took their dried fish seriously enough to draft actual regulations. The Viking assembly that resembled a mix between a town hall meeting and a gladiatorial arena, was the epicenter for such discussions. Here, chieftains would gather not only to settle disputes over land and women but also to decree the proper taxation on fish sales. Yes, there were taxes on fish. Imagine a Viking tax collector wading through a sea of dried cod, quill in hand, determining how much of your catch would fund his next ale binge. Ledgers from these gatherings reveal that fish was not only a dietary staple but also a lucrative trade item. The dried fish business was so vital that it warranted its own set of bookkeeping practices. A particularly meticulous scribe named Bjorn the Boring, okay, we made that name up, once recorded a transaction in which he noted the precise weight of fish traded for 2 goats, a barrel of mead, and one rather unfortunate-looking helmet. Dried fish, it turns out, was worth its weight in gold, well, maybe not gold, but certainly in goats and mead. Taxation was based on the amount of fish stored, with penalties for anyone daring enough to ignore the strict guidelines. Imagine a Viking being dragged to the thing for not having his fish properly aired out. I swear, I had it hanging right here, just like the law demands, he would plead, while the assembly of burly men looks on, their beards quivering with righteous indignation over the sanctity of fish storage practices. Hashtag logistics and supply chains. Now, let's talk logistics. Viking supply chains were impressive, especially considering they were managing to source dried fish in a time when logistics probably meant throw it on the longship and hope for the best. Dried fish was shipped to various settlements, and the efficiency of these operations was astonishing. Dried cod from the north would make its way down to the bustling markets of Dublin, while herring from the Baltic was shipped to Norway, where it was promptly salted and dried again, not that anyone was complaining about the extra salt, of course. To facilitate this, the Vikings constructed drying racks along their coasts. These structures, often resembling minimalist art installations, were designed to allow fish to dry in the briny sea air. The logistics of fish drying involved careful planning, as the weather could turn from favorable to, oh dear, I've just lost an entire catch to a storm, in the blink of an eye. In addition to the drying racks, Vikings had to consider storage facilities. Some were little more than sheds, while others were elaborate structures designed to keep the fish safe from marauding animals and overly curious neighbors, who might be tempted to swipe a few fillets. Imagine a Viking on lookout duty, scanning the horizon for thieves while dreaming of a world where fish could simply be ordered through an app, one click, and I'd have dried fish delivered fresh to my longhouse. What a time to be alive. Hashtag record keeping with lots of specifics. The Vikings were also surprisingly diligent when it came to record keeping. Not only did they keep track of taxes and trade, but they also meticulously documented their fish storage practices. Ledgers reveal the types of fish stored, the methods used, and even the odors associated with them. One particularly detailed ledger from the year 1005 notes that, the cod taken from the fjords had a saltiness that could shame the sea itself, and the herring smelled of misfortune, likely due to improper storage. One fascinating aspect of their record-keeping was the inclusion of fish aging. Just like fine wine, Vikings recognized that some fish could improve with age, though I doubt they ever popped a cork and swirled a glass to complement their dried fish dinners. They noted which batches were best for trading and which were best for personal consumption. The records also revealed a surprisingly complex grading system, with terms like swordfish special, herring of the heart, and cod of questionable repute. However, there was also a dark side to this record keeping. On occasion, if fish went bad, an unfortunate and smelly fate, there would be a notation of, "Do not consume," or "burn with fire." Yes, let's not forget that there were moments when a whole batch of fish would go rogue, leading to some hasty decisions. One surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. And now, dear reader, we arrive at the piece de resistance of our tale, the borderline grotesque anecdote that will forever change how you view dried fish storage. One fateful day in 978, a group of Vikings returning from a raiding expedition found themselves in a bit of a pickle, or perhaps a fishy situation. They had just captured a rival clan's longship filled with their prized salted fish, only to discover that the fish had been poorly stored. As the story goes, the rival clan had a rather innovative, and perhaps misguided, method of preserving their fish. They had stored it in a barrel with a mixture of crushed herbs and, well, let's just say some secret ingredients that included the remains of an ancient recipe for fish stew. The result? A rancid concoction that would make even the hardiest of Vikings gag. Undeterred, our heroic raiders decided to try their hand at using the fish for a celebratory feast upon their return home. They prepared the fish, mixed it with what they thought were complementary spices, and invited the entire village to partake in a grand banquet. What followed was a night for the ages, as the villagers experienced the worst case of fish-induced dysentery known to man. One account hilariously recorded that the Vikings, in the midst of their celebratory feasting, began to turn a shade of green reminiscent of the seaweed they had neglected to throw overboard. "We are warriors. We fear nothing," they shouted, just before dashing off to the nearest bush. The whole event became somewhat of a local legend, with the tale morphing into stories of Viking bravery that involved battling not just rival clans but also the very fish they had intended to celebrate. In the end, while the Viking spirit may have thrived on the high seas, the realities of dried fish storage were far less glamorous. Behind the sagas of glory and conquest, there lay a world of laws, tax collectors, and the occasional grotesque banquet gone wrong. So next time you bite into a piece of dried fish, or, heaven forbid, fermented herring, remember the not-so-glamorous history of the Vikings' culinary choices. They may have been warriors on the outside, but when it came to fish storage, they were just as likely to be battling bad odors and stomachaches as they were to be battling rival clans. The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. Ah, the Vikings! Those glorious marauders of the north, famed for their horned helmets, longships, and a rather aggressive appreciation for pillaging. Yet, beneath this veneer of sword-swinging bravado lay the mundane realities of life that have been all but forgotten in the annals of history. Amongst the sea shanties and tales of epic voyages, one finds a rather lackluster tale, the art of rationing dried fish. Yes, you read that right. Dried fish. It may not sound thrilling, but if you squint hard enough, you might just see the salty tears of a Viking home cook as they tried to figure out how to make their cod last until next harvest. Hashtag regional variations over time. Let's begin with the geography of this fishy saga. What's more exciting than a one-size-fits-all approach to food preservation? Enter the Vikings, who had the audacity to adapt their dried fish storage protocols based on regional quirks. In Norway, where the fjords are as plentiful as the fish, the locals perfected the art of drying cod on wooden racks, which were later called gel. Meanwhile, over in Iceland, where the weather is less, beach vacation, and more, frostbite festival, they favored a more robust, wind-dried method that could withstand the harsh climate. And then there's the ever-optimistic Swedes, who, despite their best intentions, often ended up with a product reminiscent of a leftover shoe after a weekend camping trip. This regional variation was not merely a culinary choice, it was a matter of survival. Without proper storage, the Vikings would have been reduced to eating the very leather of their own boots. So, kudos to those Norsemen for prioritizing fish over footwear. Hashtag laws, edicts, taxes, ledgers. Now, as any self-respecting historian will tell you, chaos often reigns in the absence of rules. Fortunately, our Viking forebears were not entirely absent-minded when it came to governance. Enter the edicts and laws surrounding dried fish. Yes, there were actual laws governing fish storage. The Gragas, the Old Norse law code, had provisions outlining how much fish each family could store, which undoubtedly led to some riveting family meetings. Okay, folks, time to gather round the table and discuss our fish quota for the month. Don't forget to bring your ledger. Taxation on fish was another thrilling chapter in this saga. The Viking Age saw the rise of fish taxes, which were levied on harvested fish to fund raids, feasts, and, let's be honest, the occasional Viking spa day. These taxes were meticulously documented in ledgers that would make any modern accountant weep with envy. Imagine a Viking scribe, quill in hand, scratching out numbers while muttering, right, 3 pounds of dried fish, 2 goats, and a partridge in a pear tree. Hashtag logistics and supply chains. Logistics. The unsung hero of any great civilization, including the Viking Age. While they may have been known for their longships and fearless raids, the Vikings also had a surprisingly sophisticated supply chain when it came to dried fish. Yes, fish storage was not just about tossing a few cod on a rack and hoping for the best. Oh no, my friends, it was a complex web of trade routes, seasonal migrations, and the occasional fishy barter. Imagine the scene, a bustling Viking market with the air thick with the smell of drying fish, sea salt, and the faint hint of desperation. Fishermen would bring their goods to the market, where they'd trade dried fish for furs, grain, or perhaps a much-needed haircut. The logistics of transporting dried fish from the coastal villages to inland markets required a highly organized network of routes, much like a medieval Amazon Prime. The Vikings also had a knack for preserving their catch for long voyages. With limited space on their ships and the ever-present threat of scurvy, they developed methods for drying fish that would make even the most seasoned survivalist nod in approval. They knew that a well-fed crew was less likely to mutiny, even if that meant subsisting on dried fish that had been hanging around longer than a disgruntled relative at Thanksgiving. #### record keeping with lots of specifics. What's the point of all this fishy business without some serious record keeping? The Vikings, despite their fierce reputation, were surprisingly meticulous when it came to documentation. Town criers, or heralds, would announce the latest fish quotas and storage guidelines, leading to a society that was at once chaotic and alarmingly organized. The ledgers kept by Viking traders included entries like, Monday, 50 pounds of dried cod, 30 pounds of herring, and 5 barrels of questionable-smelling fish sauce. They tracked expiration dates with all the fervor of a modern-day supermarket manager. This was not just a fishy pastime, it was critical for ensuring that the Viking populace didn't end up with a case of food poisoning worse than any battle wound. They also had to be vigilant about mislabeling. Nothing says, unpleasant dinner, like mistaking herring for cod. In fact, some of these records even contain detailed descriptions of the fish themselves. This herring was caught during a full moon, which we all know makes it tastier, they would scribble, as if the fish's astrological sign mattered in the grand scheme of things. Such specificity would undoubtedly make any modern-day fishmonger green with envy. #### A surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. Now that we've established the mundane intricacies of Viking fish storage, let's spice things up with a rather surprising and, dare I say, borderline grotesque anecdote. Picture this. A group of Vikings, weary from a long voyage, finally returning home to the sweet embrace of their own shores. They stumble upon a cache of dried fish that had been stored a little too long. As they gather around to feast, one brave soul, perhaps a bit too eager to assert his culinary dominance, declares, "Fear not. This fish will nourish us." He takes a hearty bite, only to be met with the taste of months-old decay. The reaction is swift, and let's just say that the aftermath involved a lot of retching, some spontaneous Viking poetry about the perils of stale cod, and a new law prohibiting fish storage beyond a certain, threshold. Legend has it that this incident led to a new Viking adage, when in doubt, throw it out. It's a lesson that has echoed through the ages, though one can only hope that the phrase was not used in other contexts, such as when deciding which of the long-haired warriors was most suitable for a raid. #### conclusion. So there you have it, folks. The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage, a tale filled with regional quirks, laws, taxes, logistics, and record-keeping, punctuated by an anecdote that reminds us that even the fiercest of warriors are not immune to the perils of expired fish. While the Vikings may be remembered for their conquests and adventures, let us not forget the unsung heroes of the dried fish industry, quietly preserving their catch and ensuring that future generations would not suffer the same fate as that poor, unfortunate soul who dared to take a bite of the past. In the grand tapestry of history, it's the little things, like the careful rationing of dried fish, that often go uncelebrated. So next time you find yourself at a seafood market, perhaps spare a thought for the Vikings and their epic struggle against the forces of spoilage. After all, in this life, we could all use a little more fish and a lot less rot. #### The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. When we think of the Vikings, images of longships slicing through icy waters, fierce battles, and bold explorations often dominate our imagination. However, lurking beneath the surface of their legendary exploits lies a more mundane yet equally fascinating aspect of Viking life: the intricate, often absurd protocols surrounding the storage and rationing of dried fish. While this topic may seem trivial, it reveals much about daily life in Viking society, their understanding of sustainability, and the delicate balance between necessity and superstition. This exploration delves into the minor figures and petty rules that govern dried fish storage, showcases intriguing case studies, compares Viking practices to those in other regions, shares archaeological tidbits, and poses thought-provoking questions to spark curiosity. ######## Minor figures and petty rules. In the Viking Age, dried fish, primarily cod, was a staple of the Norse diet, especially during the long winters when fresh provisions were scarce. However, the methods of storing and rationing this vital resource were governed by an array of minor figures and petty rules that might seem laughable today but were taken very seriously in their time. One such figure is the ration keeper, a role often assumed by the most junior member of the community, typically a child or an elderly person. Their primary task was to ensure that the dried fish was apportioned fairly and that no one took more than their allotted share. Failure to adhere to the rationing rules could lead to severe consequences, including public shaming or, in extreme cases, banishment from communal feasts. The rules themselves were often whimsical yet oddly specific. For instance, one recorded guideline stipulated that one must not take more than 2 handfuls of fish at each meal, lest the gods grow jealous and the catch dwindle. This superstition highlighted the intertwining of daily life and spirituality among the Vikings, demonstrating that their approach to rationing was as much about respect for the divine as it was about practicality. Moreover, the community would often engage in ritualistic practices before accessing the dried fish stores. A small offering would be made to Njord, the god of the sea, to ensure ample supplies. These rituals were overseen by a fish elder, a title bestowed upon the individual with the most experience in fishing and fish preservation. The fish elder would often enforce peculiar rules, such as requiring everyone to chant a specific verse before they could draw from the fish supply, creating an atmosphere of solemnity around what might otherwise be a mundane task. ######Case studies with dates and lists. To better understand the absurdity of these protocols, we can look at several case studies from different Viking settlements. 1. The Skane Settlement, 900 AD *. Incident *. A dispute arose when 2 families claimed ownership over a single barrel of dried fish. Rationing protocol *. The ration keeper was consulted, and a solution involved a public weighing of the barrel. The family that was found to have a smaller weight was required to contribute an extra fish from their next catch. Outcome *. The losing family resorted to fishing in a prohibited area, leading to a curse placed upon them by the fish elder, claiming their nets would be forever tangled. 2. The Orkney Islands, 1100 AD *. Incident *. A notorious case of a fish thief emerged when a young man was caught pilfering dried fish from communal stores. Rationing Protocol *. The community enacted a fish tribunal, where the accused was required to stand trial before the fish elder and other respected community members. Outcome *. The young man was sentenced to 3 days of fasting and had to perform a series of humiliating tasks to earn back community trust, including reciting fish poetry in front of the children. 3. Lofoten Islands, 1200 AD *. Incident *. A particularly harsh winter led to a fish shortage, sparking panic among the settlers. Rationing Protocol *. The ration keeper implemented a strict ration of 1 fish per person per day, but allowed 4 shared meals, where families could combine their rations, provided they sang a designated fish hymn together. Outcome *. While this practice fostered community spirit, it also led to a bizarre competition where families began to embellish their hymn singing, leading to theatrics that included costumes and exaggerated performances. These case studies illustrate the lengths to which Viking communities went to maintain order and harmony around their vital fish resources. While the protocols may have seemed trivial, they were imbued with social significance and often served as a means of conflict resolution. Comparisons to other regions. Viking rationing practices for dried fish can be compared to those of other contemporary cultures, particularly in regions where fish was a staple of the diet. In coastal Mediterranean communities, for instance, the preservation of fish through salting and drying was also crucial. However, their protocols were often less formalized than those of the Vikings. Mediterranean cultures typically relied on family units for fish storage, and while they did have communal aspects, they lacked the rigid oversight seen in Viking societies. In contrast, the Japanese developed their own unique methods of fish preservation, employing fermentation techniques that led to the creation of products like narazushi, an early form of sushi. The Japanese valued fish not only as sustenance but also as an art form, often leading to elaborate rituals around its consumption. Unlike the Vikings, who were bound by stringent community rules regarding fish rationing, the Japanese approach was often more individualistic, with a focus on preparation and presentation rather than strict rationing. Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological findings shed light on the Vikings' fish storage practices, revealing fascinating insights into their daily lives and the significance of dried fish. In the Lofoten Islands, excavations have uncovered large storage pits filled with remnants of dried cod, some dating back to the 10th century. These pits were often lined with branches and stones to prevent spoilage, indicating a sophisticated understanding of preservation techniques. Additionally, the discovery of fish bones at various Viking burial sites suggests that dried fish held not only nutritional value but also symbolic significance. Some graves contained offerings of dried fish, possibly intended to sustain the deceased in the afterlife, similar to other cultures' practices of including food items in burial rituals. This intertwining of sustenance and spirituality reflects the central role fish played in Viking cosmology. Another interesting archaeological tidbit involves the discovery of ancient fish hooks and nets that exhibit remarkable craftsmanship. These artifacts point to a deep communal knowledge of fishing techniques that were passed down through generations. The presence of these tools in settlement sites emphasizes the importance of fishing as a communal activity, often tied to the very identity of the Viking people. ###### Rhetorical questions. What might the bizarre and intricate protocols surrounding dried fish reveal about the social fabric of Viking society? And in a world where scarcity often breeds conflict, could these seemingly petty rules have played a crucial role in fostering community cohesion? ##### Conclusion. The history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage, while seemingly lackluster, provides a window into the complexities of Viking life. Through minor figures, petty rules, and ritualistic practices, we see a society deeply engaged with its environment and the resources it depended on for survival. The case studies illustrate the absurdity and seriousness with which these protocols were administered, while comparisons to other regions highlight the unique nature of Viking practices. Archaeological findings further enrich our understanding of these customs, revealing the profound significance of dried fish in both daily sustenance and spiritual life. Ultimately, the story of Viking fish storage transcends the mundane, offering a glimpse into the intricate tapestry of a culture that balanced ferocity and reverence, survival and superstition. The humble dried fish, it turns out, was not simply a food item, it was a cornerstone of Viking identity, community, and belief. #### The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from 793 to 1066 AD, is often romanticized in contemporary culture as an era of daring warriors and epic sea voyages. Yet, the quotidian aspects of Viking life, especially the mundane yet crucial process of rationing dried fish, tell a different story, one that is no less significant but often overlooked. The dried fish, primarily herring and cod, served as a staple food source for the Norsemen, underpinning their diets during long winters and voyages. However, the history of how these fish were stored and rationed is rife with minor figures, petty rules, and a surprising lack of flair that belies the Viking reputation for audacity. #### Minor figures and petty rules. In the grand tapestry of Viking history, minor figures often get overshadowed by legendary chieftains and warriors. Yet, among the ranks of lesser-known individuals, one can find the likes of Eirik the Fishmonger, a name that would evoke chuckles among fellow Vikings. Eirik was not a fierce warrior but rather a local merchant in the coastal town of Lofoten. His contribution to the dried fish economy was significant yet mundane. He developed what historians now refer to as the Eirik Protocol, a system for categorizing fish based on size, salt content, and drying method. Eirik's protocol mandated that larger fish be dried separately from smaller ones, as the former required more salt for preservation. This seemingly trivial rule had dire consequences for some Viking households that ignored it. Neglecting Eirik's advice could lead to spoiled provisions and, ultimately, hunger during the harsh winter months. As a result, petty disputes erupted over the correct methods, leading to the establishment of the Fish Council of Lofoten, which sought to settle arguments about fish quality with the same fervor one might reserve for a battle strategy. Moreover, local leaders, or thingmen, would often impose additional regulations. For instance, in 845 AD, the thingmen of Skane enacted a rule stating that any household caught rationing more than their fair share of dried fish would be publicly shamed and forced to provide free fish to their neighbors. This led to a culture of accusation and mistrust, with families peering through windows to ensure their neighbors weren't hoarding fish beyond the agreed-upon quota. ######case studies with dates and lists. To truly grasp the absurdity of Viking rationing practices, one need only look at specific case studies. One notable instance occurred in 900 AD in the settlement of Jelling, where a local drought led to a sudden spike in fish demand. The Jelling Fish Rationing Act sought to curtail potential hoarding and established a detailed list of fish types and their corresponding rationing limits. For example, herring, maximum of 15 dried herring per adult per week. Cod, maximum of 10 dried cod per adult per week. Mackerel, maximum of 5 dried mackerel per adult per week. Failure to adhere to these limits resulted in fines paid in the form of more fish, an ironic twist. In 965 AD, the town of Hedeby faced a fish crisis due to an unusually harsh winter. The local assembly decreed that all households must submit weekly reports on their dried fish stocks. The result was a comical series of reports filled with hyperbole. One family claimed to possess 50 fish of the finest quality, while another, more honest household, lamented that their stock had dwindled to a mere handful. The assembly ultimately decided to redistribute fish from households with excess to those facing shortages, leading to widespread resentment among those who had successfully adhered to rationing rules. Comparisons to other regions. When comparing Viking fish rationing protocols to those of other regions during the same period, one finds a striking contrast. For instance, the Mediterranean cultures, adept in both fishing and preserving seafood through methods like salting and smoking, had far less stringent rationing rules. In Rome, for example, the abundance of fish led to a more laissez-faire approach to consumption, where overfishing was often a more pressing concern than rationing. The Romans often relied on the caveat emptor principle, allowing market forces to dictate supply and demand without the need for rigid regulations. In contrast, the Vikings were often bound by geographical limitations and seasonal changes, leading to a more desperate need for stringent guidelines. In the Baltic region, Slavic tribes had their own methods of fish preservation, often utilizing fermentation, which didn't necessitate the elaborate rationing systems found in Scandinavia. This difference highlights the Vikings' unique struggles and adaptations within their harsh environment. What accounts for such a contrast in fish storage protocols? Was it the geographical constraints of the north, or was it something deeper in the Viking psyche that demanded order even in the chaos of survival? Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological findings have revealed that Viking fish storage practices were as varied as they were quirky. In 1985, a dig in the ruins of a Viking longhouse in Norway uncovered a cache of dried herring tucked away behind a wall. The herring was found to be from the year 1000 AD and was preserved using a unique method involving layers of seaweed. This discovery led researchers to hypothesize that the fish was intentionally hidden from potential thieves or neighbors who might rat on the family for hoarding. Additionally, a study conducted in 2012 at the site of a Viking trading post in Birka found remnants of fish bones alongside tools that were presumably used for drying and salting. Interestingly, the research indicated that the Vikings had a penchant for variety. They often mixed different types of fish in their drying racks, leading to a unique flavor profile. This practice, however, complicated rationing, as it became difficult to ascertain which fish belonged to which household, further fueling the petty disputes that had become commonplace. Moreover, some excavations have revealed ancient storage pits, lined with tar and seaweed, specifically designed to keep fish fresh. These pits, often referred to as fish vaults, were ingeniously constructed but also led to conflicts over ownership. As one can imagine, accusations of theft were rampant, as families would often claim that fish stored in a community vault belonged solely to them. ######## Rhetorical questions. As we delve into the rich yet lackluster history of Viking dried fish storage, one must wonder, how did a society known for its seafaring prowess and warrior spirit become bogged down in such trivialities? And in a culture steeped in valor and adventure, what drove the Vikings to obsess over the minutiae of fish rationing while the world beyond their shores was rife with exploration and conquest? ######## Conclusion. The history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage is a fascinating yet often overlooked aspect of their daily lives. While the tales of grand voyages and fierce battles captivate our imagination, the reality of survival in a harsh environment often revolved around such mundane practices. Through minor figures like Eirik the fishmonger, petty rules imposed by local leaders, and the absurdity of case studies, we gain a fuller picture of the complexities and challenges faced by the Vikings. In delving into this history, we also uncover the contrasts with other cultures, the archaeological evidence that sheds light on their practices, and the rhetorical questions that invite deeper reflection on the nature of human society. Ultimately, the lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage serves as a reminder that even in the grand narratives of history, the ordinary can be just as compelling as the extraordinary. #### The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. The Vikings are often romanticized as fierce warriors and seafaring adventurers, but behind their legendary raids and conquests lay a more mundane reality, a complex system of food storage and rationing that reflected their need for survival in harsh climates. Among their most vital resources was dried fish, a staple that sustained entire communities during long winters and voyages. However, the history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage is marked not just by grand epics but by minor figures, petty rules, and peculiar practices that have largely faded into obscurity. #### Minor figures and petty rules. While the sagas tell tales of great chieftains and mighty warriors, the everyday lives of the average Viking were often dictated by lesser-known figures. Take, for instance, the case of Thorvald Torsk, a minor fish merchant in the coastal village of Kaupang in the 10th century. His meticulous records, discovered in a collection of runestones, detail the petty rules governing the distribution of dried fish. Thorvald was notorious for implementing a two-fish rule, which dictated that no household could store more than 2 large cod for the winter. This arbitrary limit was not based on the actual needs of families but rather on Thorvald's desire to maintain a semblance of equality among villagers. The rationale behind such rules often boiled down to a blend of superstition and practicality. Villagers believed that overstocking fish would invite misfortune, a superstition that Thorvald leveraged to keep his influence intact. The two-fish rule became a source of contention, leading to clandestine fish stashing operations that turned neighbors into rivals. #####Case studies with dates and lists. The Viking Age, generally considered to span from 793 to 1066 CE, provides several examples of how food rationing, especially of dried fish, was executed. A particularly revealing case study occurs in the year 1020 CE in the settlement of Jelling, Denmark. Here, a local assembly, known as the Thing, enacted a series of protocols to manage food supplies during a particularly harsh winter. The regulations included: 1. Monthly rationing. Families were allotted a set amount of dried fish based on the number of mouths to feed. A family of 4 was permitted 6 dried cod per month. 2. Quality control. Fish that had been deemed unfit for human consumption by the village elder could be recycled as animal feed, emphasizing the importance of maximizing resources. 3. Storage locations. Only designated storage areas were permitted for dried fish, which had to be elevated from the ground to prevent spoilage. 4. Inspection days. Monthly inspections were mandated, and any household found hoarding fish faced penalties that included fines payable in silver or additional labor for the community. The Jelling protocols were not unique. Similar measures were recorded in another settlement in 1042 CE, in the Orkney Islands, where local chieftains implemented a fish-sharing initiative. This initiative required wealthier families to donate a portion of their dried fish to those in need, creating a rudimentary welfare system that spoke to the communal nature of Viking society. Comparisons to other regions. The Viking methods of rationing dried fish can be contrasted with the practices in other regions, particularly those of the Mediterranean and East Asian cultures. In the Mediterranean, for example, salted fish like anchovies and sardines were common, preserved in barrels and widely traded. Unlike the Vikings, who primarily relied on drying, Mediterranean cultures developed a sophisticated market for salted fish, allowing for greater variety and trade across regions. Moreover, the East Asian cultures, particularly the Japanese, had their own fish preservation techniques, such as fermentation, narazushi, and drying, which were often detailed in texts like the Nihon Shoki, dating back to 720 CE. However, while the Japanese focused on enhancing the flavor of the fish through fermentation, Vikings primarily aimed for longevity and sustenance, emphasizing the utilitarian aspect of their food storage methods. This divergence in practices raises an intriguing question: Were the Vikings' rationing protocols a reflection of their harsh environment, or did they stem from a cultural ethos that prioritized communal survival over individual abundance? Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological digs across Scandinavia have unearthed fascinating remnants of Viking dried fish storage practices. One of the most significant finds occurred in 1954 at the site of an ancient Viking fish drying facility in Lofoten, Norway. Researchers discovered large drying racks and remnants of cod heads, which were often discarded after the fillets were cut away. Additionally, a cache of Viking-era clay pots, found in a burial site in Gotland, Sweden, revealed that even the vessels used for transporting dried fish were highly specialized. These pots featured intricate designs that suggested their primary use was for preserving fish oil, a valuable commodity that Vikings would have traded with neighboring cultures. The finds have led to further questions about the extent of Viking trade networks. Did the demand for dried fish drive them to establish connections as far away as Byzantium? Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking traders were indeed engaged in extensive trade, exchanging dried fish for spices and textiles. This leads us to ponder, what other secrets about Viking life remain hidden beneath layers of earth and time? Conclusion. As we delve into the lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage, we uncover a tapestry woven with minor figures, petty rules, and unexpected communal practices. The tales of Thorvald Torsk and the assemblies of Jelling reveal a society grappling with the realities of survival while attempting to maintain cohesion in the face of adversity. The comparative lens through which we examine Viking practices against those of other cultures only enriches our understanding of their unique ethos and survival strategies. And the archaeological discoveries continue to shed light on the complexities of Viking life, inviting us to reconsider what we know about these people who lived so long ago. As we ponder the questions raised throughout this exploration, were the Vikings' rationing protocols a reflection of their environment or a manifestation of cultural values, and what other hidden aspects of their lives might we uncover? We find ourselves standing at the precipice of history, eager to learn more about the intricate lives of the Vikings beyond their fearsome reputation. The lackluster history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage. The Vikings are often romanticized as fierce warriors and seafaring adventurers, but behind their legendary raids and conquests lay a more mundane reality, a complex system of food storage and rationing that reflected their need for survival in harsh climates. Among their most vital resources was dried fish, a staple that sustained entire communities during long winters and voyages. However, the history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage reveals a less heroic but equally essential aspect of their society. The practice of drying fish can be traced back to the early 9th century, particularly in regions like Norway, where the abundance of cod and herring made it a practical choice for preservation. The Vikings discovered that by hanging fish on wooden racks, they could eliminate moisture and extend the shelf life of their catch. This method not only allowed for storage during the long, harsh winters but also facilitated maritime travel, as dried fish could be easily transported without the risk of spoilage. One of the most notable examples of this practice was the Lofoten Islands, where, In the late 10th century, the Viking settlements thrived primarily due to their successful fisheries. Here, the fishing season typically ran from January to April, coinciding with the herring migration. Fishermen would gather in droves, ensuring that the catch was plentiful. By May, the fish were processed, salted, and hung to dry. This method of preservation is said to have produced a product called klippfisk, which became a vital export as far afield as the Mediterranean. To better understand the Viking protocols surrounding dried fish storage, one must consider the specific techniques and measurements used during this process. The Vikings employed a range of drying methods, including air drying and smoking, depending on available resources and intended storage duration. For instance, air-dried fish typically required a humidity of around 60% and a temperature between 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, to achieve optimal results. Conversely, smoking fish required careful temperature regulation to prevent cooking, generally maintaining heat levels below 60 degrees Celsius 140 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure preservation without compromising flavor. Additionally, the Vikings had a keen understanding of the nutritional value of dried fish, which was crucial for sustaining energy levels during voyages or periods of scarcity. A typical serving of dried cod could provide upwards of 60 grams of protein and essential omega-3 fatty acids, making it an indispensable part of the Viking diet. Historical accounts suggest that a single longship could carry approximately 2,000 pounds of dried fish, which would serve a crew of 30 men for several months. This allowed them to undertake extended voyages, such as those to Newfoundland around the year 1000 AD, where they established temporary settlements. Moreover, rationing protocols were critical in ensuring that the dried fish lasted throughout the winter months. Vikings would often divide their supplies into portions that could be consumed over a span of weeks or months, closely monitoring their intake to avoid overconsumption. Historical evidence, such as the well-preserved remains found at the archaeological site of Birka in Sweden, indicates that Viking households often had designated storage areas for dried fish, equipped with shelves and hooks for hanging the fish. These spaces were typically well ventilated to prevent spoilage and pest infestations, showcasing the Vikings' ingenuity in food preservation. The historical context of Viking fish storage also sheds light on the broader trade networks established during the Viking Age, circa 793–1066 AD. Dried fish became a significant commodity, traded not only within Scandinavia but also with regions as far away as Byzantium and the Islamic world. The establishment of trading posts like Hedeby and Birka facilitated the exchange of goods, including dried fish, which played a crucial role in the Viking economy. Additionally, the monetary value of dried fish was recognized, with some accounts suggesting that it could be used as a form of currency in certain transactions. In conclusion, the history of Viking rationing protocols for dried fish storage unveils a multifaceted understanding of Viking life, extending beyond their warrior image into the realm of survival and resource management. Through specific drying techniques, careful rationing, and a strategic approach to trade, the Vikings adeptly navigated the challenges posed by their environment, ensuring that dried fish remained a cornerstone of their diet and a critical factor in their exploratory endeavors. The legacy of these practices continues to inform our understanding of historical food preservation and the resilience of communities in the face of adversity. And that's a wrap on today's episode. We unraveled the mysteries of topic faster than a cat chasing a laser pointer. Who knew that surprising fact related to the topic would leave us scratching our heads? Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more mind-bending content. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below with your thoughts or any wild theories you have. If you enjoyed this dive into topic, check out our related episodes on related topics for even more fun. Trust me, you won't want to miss them. And hey, turn on loop so this episode can play on repeat until you drift off into dreamland. Sweet dreams.